Welcome to the Lessons from Leaders podcast. I'm your host, Brian Beckham. My next guests are Justin Zorn and Leigh Marz. Justin and Leigh are the authors of a great book called Golden, The Power of Silence in a World of Noise. The book is based on a Harvard Business Review article that they wrote about silence that ended up going viral, became very, very popular, and so they expanded into a book. Justin and Leigh take us on an unlikely journey from the West Wing of the White House to death row in San Quentin, from Ivy League brain research laboratories to underground psychedelic circles, from Olympic National Park to heavy metal festivals. This book reveals how to go beyond ordinary mindfulness, ordinary meditation, things like that, into how to find silence both externally and internally in this very, very noisy world. It's a great interview. I think you're going to like it a lot. I've learned a lot about the power of silence myself recently, including learning about when to be quiet in federal court. I learned that lesson in February of 2023, and we talk about that a little bit on the podcast. We also talk about how silence gives you power. People that are able to control themselves, including being silent, are often perceived as more powerful than people that can't. So it's a great discussion about a lot of different interesting topics, and I give you Justin Zorn and Leigh Marz. Hey, everybody. Brian Beckham here, and I have got Leigh Marz and Justin Talbert Zorn. Justin, you got three names, man. You must be really, really important, right?
He is.
You guys are. We have been trying to get together for months now. You guys have a fantastic book called Golden, The Power of Silence in a World of Noise. You talk about a lot of very, very, what at first impression, maybe kind of different topics: San Quentin death row, the White House, the underground psychedelic scene, all these sorts of things. But a lot of these things have something in common. And I'm really, really happy to have you guys on the show. Before we get into your book and, some of the topics in the book, tell us a little bit about yourself. We'll start with ladies first. I'm a Texan, so I try to kind of be chivalrous in that way. So, Leigh, tell us a little bit about yourself. Where are you from? How'd you get where you are today? And what was it that got you to collaborate with Justin on this awesome book?
Well, thank you for having us. Well, I live in Berkeley, California. I'm not from here, but I sure did find it to be home when I got here. So this is home, and my family's here. My husband, fourth generation here, so we're very much West Coast. And I've been doing work as a consultant, a collaboration coach, I call myself, where I bring groups together to work on complex issues, like getting toxic chemicals out of our products in our homes. So I'm the one who helps facilitate that. So there's a lot about really coming together to work a little differently. And I found things like silence and just shifting the way we're doing things, tuning in a little differently to the task at hand, and creating and building some relationships. Those are the kinds of things that I've been using in that work. But I guess it wasn't really until I got introduced to Justin, which I'm so happy I did. A friend got a sense that we should know one another, and it turns out she was completely right. And that was a game changer for both of us. So we've been on this journey as we sort of explored what we were meant to do together. We started writing, and one of the things we wrote was an article for Harvard Business Review that unexpectedly went viral, and was about silence and how to bring that into the workplace a little bit and help us strategizing and clear strategy. And that set us on the journey of writing this book, because the response was so big, it caused us to step back and really pay attention to what was being asked of us. And I'll let Justin pick up once he gives his intro. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, when you were just before I get to Justin, when you were
Sure.
working on the article, did you have a sense that it might go viral or might become popular? Or was it something you expected, or was it just, hey, let's write this article? Because and the reason I asked that, Leigh, is because a lot of people nowadays are intentionally trying to make whatever it is, their video or their little, short TikTok, whatever, make it go viral. So this was a after effect, not kind of the point of writing the article, right? So you were fairly surprised by how well it was received.
Yeah, very surprised. But what I say looking back, thinking about the process of writing this book, is that we were definitely attuning to something important when we went through that process. Now, whether others would tune into that in the same way or not, we had no idea. But I do think there was something we were learning about that we used throughout this book about really attuning to each other and attuning to the topic, in this case of silence, that paid off. Yeah.
Nice. Justin, what about you? What's your story?
What is my story? I'm still figuring that out, Brian. But as of now, my story is I'm the father of 3-year-old twins and a 6-year-old out here in Santa Fe, New Mexico, a place I really love calling home. Grew up in Central Florida, lived in Washington, D.C., lived overseas, UK, lived in Boston for a little while. And this place feels like home for me. I spent many years working in the U.S. Congress on policy issues, working in D.C. and a variety of foreign policy, economic policy, environmental issues. And I still do a good amount of that work, along with the writing work, and been on this book tour with Leigh. And for a lot of people, Brian, seeing me as someone who's really been in the belly of the beast in these very noisy, loud societal questions, it was a little bit of a surprise, I think, for some people to say, well, why'd you write a book about silence?
Yeah.
And for me, it was like, it came up about 6 or so years ago. It was about 2017. Leigh and I connected about how we were just feeling overwhelmed, not just with our own lives, the intensity, the stress of modern professional life, and just the bombardment of noise in the world, but as communities, as societies, like how we can get through the division we're facing, the challenges we're facing, the uncertainties that we're facing. And we both just felt this intuition, Brian, that, irrespective of ideology, irrespective of where you're coming from, the prerequisite to doing anything positive right now would be getting beyond the noise. Getting beyond the noise, in the sense that we often hear about, taking a break from technology, social media, but also something deeper, actually tuning into what we call pristine attention, actually tuning into deep silence, finding pockets of silence in our lives. And that intuition, deeper levels of creativity, deeper levels of good judgment and decision-making would come from this space of silence. And that's what led to us writing this Harvard Business Review article that Leigh mentioned, which, to your question, and as Leigh said, was a real surprise to us and led us to just start interviewing some people, neuroscientists, poets, activists, executives, politicians, you name it, an extraordinary mix of people. And really the common denominator to our discussions was the question, what's the deepest silence you've ever known? And the answers surprised us, and it set us on the course of writing this book.
What absolutely phenomenal question. So let me ask, and as we go forward, guys, either one of you feel free to jump in at any point. But
Yeah.
What you both said, there's a lot of meat on those bones. So let's start. And we were talking before the podcast about, I think you guys said you'd been on 70 plus podcasts as part of this book tour, talking about this book. We're now talking about the book. It's a little bit ironic that we're having a conversation in words about a book about silence. But when I think of silence, I kind of think of it in two different ways, at least for me personally. And I'd like one or both of you to comment on this. So I think of silence in terms of like the exterior world and all of the being bombarded by mainly screens nowadays. But I think of the fact that unless you carve out some time intentionally for yourself, basically everything that's happening on a daily basis is input. Like it's just constant input into your brain. And so I think of that as kind of the exterior component of silence. Like, how can you silence the exterior noise? But then there's a whole nother, to me, the interior noise, like the noises in your head, the voices or the images, whatever you want to call it. For people that meditate a lot, I think you'll realize that basically the way your brain works is in like kind of in mental sounds and mental images. And so those can be just as distracting and debilitating as all the external noise. So how do you deal with, and I know this is a very broad question, but how do you deal with those two types of noise? Like, do you consider them fundamentally to be kind of the same problem to solve, or those two different problems to solve?
I love that you're just right off getting that. We do look at, as a starting point, silence as the absence of noise, that external environment you described. And then it felt important to us that we look at that noise on the auditory level, that which happens in our ears, but also that which comes at us through information, often through our screens, so that's today's dilemma, right? So those are both external types of noise, and that silence that we might be seeking out that could help us perhaps turn our attention to what's happening inside, which is where things get really interesting as far as we're concerned. So the noise, looking at the noise internally, that internal chatter you pointed to, which Ethan Cross, this researcher in University of Michigan, estimates we're listening to something like 320 State of the Union addresses every day of mental chatter going through our minds. So this is like a big problem.
Yeah, for
it's a
sure.
big problem. And that internal compressed speech is often not helpful. It's often ruminative, it's often worry, it's often anxiety. And we can just see the rise of all those issues of anxiety and depression happening. So there's this interplay between that external noise and internal noise, and that external silence and internal silence. There's a relationship we wanted to bring attention to. When we started to think about, like, well, maybe we should just talk about auditory noise, it felt too limited. This is more the way we're living in the world, is with this interplay of noise and silence, external and internal. What would you add, Justin?
What were you going to say, Brian? I think you covered that beautifully.
I think that was beautiful too. What I was going to say was, I still remember, I've been a meditator for probably roughly 15 years now. I still remember the first time I sat down to meditate. It was 5 minutes, and I was like, oh my goodness, this feels like an eternity. I cannot believe how my mind will, sorry for what I'm about to say, my mind will not shut the fuck up. Like, really, like, what the hell is going on here? You know what I mean? And
yep.
And what I found is, and especially nowadays, and so comment on this if you don't mind. So I found that, like, for example, if I'm in Colorado in the summer and I want to go on a hike, I can put my AirPods in and listen to a podcast for 2 hours and get no silence, essentially, and get none of the benefits of the hike. Or I can just walk around in nature for 2 hours, and it's a completely different experience, especially interiorly. So what I found is, like, if you wanted to nowadays in 2023, if you wanted to, you could be bombarded by external stimulus for basically your entire waking life. Like, you if you wanted to, you could have no time to actually think. And if you're being bombarded by external stimulus all the time, then really, are you a conscious, independent agent at all? Are you being controlled by outside forces? So what is it that, like, give us some specific kind of recommendations for how people in today's tumultuous times can carve out a space to have some personal silence for themselves.
I think the first answer, the most important answer, is to want it, to recognize that it's important, to recognize that it's valuable. Because what you just said, Brian, about that choice you have when you go on a 2-hour hike in Colorado, that choice of whether to just listen to a podcast for those 2 hours. Nothing against podcasts. We love them. We're here with it.
We're on one. Yeah.
But But, like you were talking about, the irony of us getting together and talking about silence. No, we get it. And for us, writing a book, hundreds of pages about silence, it was really, and I remember we had a wonderful conversation about this with our excellent editor, HarperCollins, just saying, hey, should we just be writing a book with a lot more silence in it? We did work to bring some meditative moments into the book and to weave a kind of energy of silence into the book. But there's a lot of words in there. There's a lot of scientific arguments, a lot of political and economic ideas. And the reason we made this choice, Brian, and the reason we've made this choice to be on this podcast tour and all this is because we need to make the case that taking those AirPods out once in a while, at least once in a while, we need to make the case that there's something edifying for the brain, in terms of our health, in terms of what the science says, but also an opportunity to connect to creativity, clarity, deeper attention, deeper, more fulfilling relationships, intuition, if we tune into the silence, at least from time to time. So we wrote this book really as a kind of active worldly case. We think of it as a kind of non-meditator's guide to getting beyond the noise. So why it's valuable to take those AirPods out and listen to the sounds of the breezes in the branches and simply focus on your breath, focus on the feeling of the footsteps when you're on that hike in Colorado. So we could get into some strategies. We've got in the book 33 ways to find silence in a world of noise. And a lot of these strategies really come down to a really simple, essential teaching of just notice noise, tune into silence. Notice where there's distraction, not just that auditory noise, but also that informational noise, that internal noise, like Leigh was talking about. Noise in the sense of what's keeping you from your true perception and intention. Pay attention to where that's happening in your life. Study how to navigate it. And then where possible, find these pockets of peace, even if they're only available for a few seconds. How can you focus not so much on the quantity of the silence, but the quality of the silence? How deeply can you go into those few seconds when you have them? And then from time to time, find this deeper, more rapturous silence, like maybe that 2-hour or more hike when you're out in Colorado.
What is it? So let me give you guys a good example. Before the podcast, we were talking about, I spent basically the month of February in San Francisco in federal court in front of a senior judge who was fairly strict. I'll just put it that way. And if any lawyer said anything within 5 seconds of her saying anything, she'd say, "Stop interrupting me! Stop interrupting me!" So I had to really calm myself. I had to pause. I had to think. I had to wait for her to answer. Because see, and it's not just lawyers, by the way, it's everybody. But I think there's a tendency when you're in that kind of setting to want to kind of jump in and to kind of want to talk over people and stuff like that. And every time any lawyer in this case did that, she jumped down our throats. And so what I found though, by the end of the trial was there was much more power in staying silent for a little bit, as opposed to like jumping out there and trying to say something or trying to get some words past somebody. So I come back from this trial and I told my law partner, I said, man, I've learned a lot of things. One of them is how to shut up in court until it's my turn to talk. And so long story short, I go to a federal court hearing in Houston a couple weeks ago. And I sat there and the other side, that jabber, talking to the judge. They wanted to talk first. They talked forever. And I just sat there. And when they were done having their conversation, I didn't say anything. I just sat there. I was silent. And the judge, after 4 or 5 seconds, looks over and says, "Mr. Beckham, do you have anything to add?" And I said, well, thank you, Your Honor. Actually, I do. And then I gave my little talk, and it was amazing how like everybody was like looking to me for like, what does Brian think about this? Brian, what do you think about that? And it was because I had learned finally after 25 years of being a lawyer, when to shut up, when to be quiet, when to be silent. So what I discovered was, and I probably should have discovered this long ago, was there's tremendous power in the ability to be silent, but both in the external world and to have to have a silent mind, or a relatively silent mind. So talk about that a little bit,
Mhm.
Leigh. Talk about the power. Like when we say the power of silence, what are we talking about there?
Yeah, in the book, we turn to this ancient Japanese principle of ma, which I feel like is very much what you're pointing us towards. So, a synonym is silence, emptiness, nothingness, but our favorite synonym is pure potentiality. So, in the Japanese aesthetic principles, if you think about ikebana flower arrangement, with the branches and the petals and the leaves, that is the artistic form. But what you're taking in is the empty space around those petals and branches and leaves, as well as the actual, object. So it's the wholeness of that. The empty space is that pure potentiality. With calligraphy, the swoosh of the paintbrush, but also the empty space around that. With conversation, and if I have a lot of Japanese colleagues in the work I do, there's a real intentionality and a real space between what is said. What is spoken is important, but what is unspoken is also very important. So we give, in this, what we've just gone so far towards the content and the words and to the fast and the quick. We're a little seduced by that, I would say, over here. But the wholeness is having that space for the content and the space for the pure potentiality, which is what I think of when you say that. There was that suddenly, like, you're centering, because it's not just quiet outside, you're quiet inside. And then what you're speaking to, breaking that silence with words that are so much more connected to what's going on. So that is totally it. That is what we're trying to invite back into our lives, a sense of this wholeness that respects and creates space for and appreciates that silence. It is really like the quality of the words I gather from you, like, and how the whole room was responding differently from you. That's ideally how we could move more through the world.
I found it. I just found it stunning. And one of the things I noticed, by the way, was as the other lawyers on my adversaries were talking, what I used to do is my brain would be formulating a response while they were talking, and I wasn't really. I mean, I was kind of listening, but not really paying close attention to what they were saying. What I found when I set out with an intention not to say anything until I was called upon was I paid very careful attention to what the other side was saying, because I wasn't as worried about, I got to say what I want to say. Like I wasn't as worried about getting my 2 cents in. So I paid a lot closer attention and understood a lot more about where they were coming from. So when it ultimately was my time to say something, I think what I said was a lot more impactful. It's kind of like, I tell my clients sometime when I'm getting ready for depositions, pay real careful attention to what the lawyer is asking you, and don't pay attention like I pay attention to my wife sometime, where I'm going, yes, honey. But really I'm thinking about, man, I got to go play golf with the guys, or I'm thinking about 15 other things. Like really pay attention. And I think one of the things that's nice about coming from kind of a perspective of, I want to say less, I want to have some silence, is your ability to pay attention to other people increases, or at least that's what I found. So Justin, comment on that a little bit if you don't mind.
Hmm. One thing we emphasized, Brian, in that Harvard Business Review piece we were talking about, was something that doesn't often get thought of as silence, because we think of silence as like, how noisy is it in our surroundings, or even just as we were just talking about it, as like the distraction. But like, we explored this idea in that article that there is a kind of experience that is so rare in this world right now, which is taking a break from one of life's most basic responsibilities, taking a break from having to think of what to say. What you're talking about being in the courtroom in that way is like, so much of the time we're with other people, we're thinking of what we're going to say next. And that's not just like self-centeredness or something like that. That's the name of the game in our society. It's like we always have to keep up those mental reflexes to protect our reputation or promote a point of view. It's like, that's our assumption of what life is about. What am I going to say? How am I going to keep up the entertainment? How am I going to keep things interesting? But can we come into a space where it's not like we feel that responsibility to fill the space, where we don't feel that responsibility to entertain and inform or put forward an argument, but can be in presence?
So there's a I'm sorry I keep using lawyers as examples, but I think
I love it.
lawyers are good examples because lawyers like to talk a lot. So when you
Sure.
find a
Lawyers is
lawyer,
such a good example, Brian. It's I love it. Yeah. Go for it.
when you find a lawyer that knows something about silence, that's finding the black swan, basically. But
Right.
there's this. So there was this famous lawyer in Houston, John O'Quinn. He's now dead, but he used to give these talks about how he would make his jury arguments. And one of the things he would do is when the judge would call him up, Mr. O'Quinn, it's time to make your argument. He'd walk up there and he would get the podium position, and he'd fumble around with his papers, and he'd walk over and make sure he got the right paper from and then he'd grab some water. And he's not saying anything this whole time. And it seems like it takes forever, but it's probably only like a minute or two of him shuffling around. And like and this is like when he's given these presentations, he does this in these presentations too, not just in court. Mr. O'Quinn, he's going to give a speech about, trying cases. And so he walks up there and he's shuffling around for a minute. And you're like sitting there going, when is this guy going to say something? And it's like amazingly powerful. Because everybody, just like you said, Justin, people want to fill this space up. Like there's this space that people just like, I got to fill this with noise somehow. And when you let that space just hang out there for a little bit, of course, after 30 seconds, everybody's on the edge of their seat going, I cannot wait to hear what this guy is about to say. So I think you guys probably know what I'm talking about. Why is that kind of thing so powerful?
Well, again, I think it's such the opposite of our default in terms of filling the space maximally, like at all times. And we see it in the workplaces all the time with these sort of back-to-back meetings and brainstorming sessions, which is a tyranny of the fastest and loudest. And it's just content. And so it's a little bit like the story we tell ourselves is you get that attention that you're desiring by being fast and quick and loud. And full of great words. That's the story we tell ourselves. But when in truth, it's really, especially in contrast to this, if we can just pause at the beginning of a meeting, for example, and orient to the purpose of us coming together for this meeting, and just even take 30 seconds. I don't even know if it's 30 seconds. It could be 15, it could be 10. The human, pristine human attention going to that combined effort instead of like, I gotta show up in this meeting. I gotta get my voice heard. I gotta advocate, instead of all those things, all the things that happen, if we can just actually orient towards the purpose of that, it just all goes faster. It all goes smoother. So that pristine human attention is terribly, terribly endangered right now. So we look at that auditory noise in our ears, and that's a big problem. There is no question. The world is getting louder than, it's louder than it's ever been. And that is having an impact on our entire body systems. But the attentional demands of information overload that we have, and all this attention grabbing for our attention mercilessly, notifications and bings and this, and you've got to respond to your IMs immediately. And why didn't you, blah, 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 all that. Our attentional capacities have not increased at all in hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. We have this limited amount of attention to give, and yet more demands on it than ever before. So I think that this really putting our full attention on something is so extraordinarily rare, and so much can get done when we do that. So that command, that respect, all those things, so you can be heard, and you like you, when you stopped, and me, when I stop, it's like, I can also actually catch up with myself and say what needs to be said. And throughout this, even as we're talking here, trying very much to not get ahead of like, oh, what are all the talking points, blah, 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 but really what is the conversation that is trying to happen here with the three of us right now in this moment? What is most of service to this?
You just said something I think that's really important to flag, and that is human attention hasn't really increased in hundreds of years. I would actually suggest, Lee, that at least my observations are, and I know this isn't any sort of scientific observation or anything, but our attention spans have gotten a lot shorter. And I find I can actually remember the 2016 election. I was on Twitter and all the social media sites, and I felt like I was having a mental breakdown, frankly. Like I could not, there was so much noise, there was so much external input coming into my brain that I finally was like, man, I got to shut all this down. I went so far as to remove my computer from my office and put it in a place where it was hard to get to. So, and like, I was like, I got to put my phone in another room if I want to do some really, deep focus work. But it was a real problem for me, Lee, in 2016. And I was like, not only is my attention span getting shorter, it's getting a lot shorter. Like it is hard for me to focus like I used to be able to focus on things that require focus. So what I told you some of the things I did. The other thing I started doing is the first thing I do every morning. I go outside to try to meditate a little bit, and then I read a physical hardback book of some sort because I feel like that helps my longer term concentration as opposed to reading a tweet or something on social media or something like that. And the other thing I've found, and I would love to hear either Lee or Justin, either one of you guys comment on this, is the ability to focus for an extended period of time in silence on a single task is becoming a superpower. Like not many people can do that anymore. And if you have the ability to do that, you are way ahead of the game, so to speak. So comment, I want to go a little deeper, Lee, on this comment about the powers of attention and whether maybe they've gotten a little, not only not increased, but gotten a little bit worse, whether there's things we can do about it, whether we can, I actually believe that things like meditation, you can increase your attention span. Like, I think it's like a muscle essentially, and you can train it if you want to. So comment on this idea of your attention span a little bit more.
Sure, I could get us started here. This idea that we actually have shorter attention spans is something that it's sometimes empirically difficult to measure, but there's a lot of proxy indicators of it out there. I mean, just if you look at the amount of information a human being is taken in, according to a study that was conducted a few years ago, people in the United States take in 5 times as much information as they did in 1986. 5 times as much information. And the research that Lee was mentioning was performed by the famous positive psychologist Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, who was famous for his work on flow.
Yeah, I can't believe you actually know how to pronounce his last name, not to interrupt
Lee's better at it. Lee's better at it than I. She's meticulous about it. Yeah,
absolutely foundational book in the subject of attention. So for people that don't, I think this book came out in the 80s or something like that. But
that's right.
It's a famous book about essentially achieving flow states and the idea about what is a flow state. So I didn't mean to interrupt you, Justin, but just for people that don't know, this book is well worth reading if you're interested in any of these topics.
And he was an academic psychologist, and he did some work to find that the average human being needs to take in about 60 bits of information per second to understand what another person is saying. I mean, that's a measurable amount of data. That's on average about 60 bits. And the upper bound of what a human being can comprehend is about 120, 125 bits, something like that. So if we're going to layer in, all right, I'm going to think about what's for dinner, I'm going to think about even what I'm going to say next, we start rapidly approaching that upper bound of how much information we can comprehend. So as this fire hose of information is getting turned on, and at least 5 times as much information as 1986, because this doesn't account for this age of AI that we're now entering, we are not changing that upward bound of how much we can comprehend. So it is, the amount of information is increasing. Our capacity to deal with it is not necessarily. So I agree with you for sure that meditation is a way to train the brain. But what we want to avoid doing in this book is just saying, oh, go meditate and it'll be okay. Because the name of the game is maximum sound and stimulus. The name of the game is distraction right now. And we see a lot of friends of ours, and sometimes we ourselves, just like beat ourselves up for not meditating enough. I mean, it sounds like you've got a very good practice of, physical books that you read and taking that time to meditate outside in the mornings. And not everyone is doing that. And we want to, give people license to explore an unbounded range of approaches for finding this pristine attention. What is it that brings you quiet? Because when we asked all these people, what's the deepest silence you've ever known? They often, as we were talking about before, they often describe situations that auditorily may not have even seemed quiet. Running the perfect line through roaring rapids, or even the 4 a.m. mark at an all-night dance party, where they were just in a place where there was no room for ruminative thought, for distracting, discursive thought to enter, because they were so immersed in the presence of what they were doing. So it's like, if we can develop the appreciation for these states of pristine attention and then open up to all different kinds of strategies for how we find it, then we have some faith, Brian, that we can overcome these, challenges of inattention that we're passing through and all that comes with that.
And these
Part of why, sorry, I was just going to say, it's part of why we turned to Csikszentmihalyi, and it's not just an excuse to say his name, but Mihai Csikszentmihalyi is that he brings in flow, and flow is something that he found to be like a globally understood experience. Whatever the word was, there was some type of word for flow in all these cultures and all around the world. So that flow state, we're finding our attention focus so that we can, do the task at hand, that running the perfect line through roaring rapids, or dancing in the dance studio like I did this morning. So there's no extra attentional capacity for that internal chatter, that ruminative thought, the self-reflective thinking. We basically don't have enough attention available to tell ourselves stories about ourselves. We're just all in. We're pristine attention all in. So whether it's, meditation like you were describing, or flow states in their myriad forms, including micro flow states like doodling and reading, deep reading, or moments of awe, as people pointed us towards in their lives, just moments where that egoic self falls away and you somehow feel connected to, life, humanity, nature, whatever it is you feel connected to, God, or mystical experiences. Who knows? There's so many routes in, or experiences brought about through psychedelics and other, mind expanding chemicals. There's all kinds of routes. And so that we find our way is what we're interested in. So in this book, even though we have 33 ways to find silence, the idea is to really get ourselves tuned into what are the ways that we truly do find silence. If it's meditation, awesome. If it's dancing like I did this morning in a loud studio, but with no extra space for the internal chatter and storytelling, like that's my quiet, ironically, right? So what are the things that truly bring us quiet? And whatever that is, honor it and do more of it, and know that it's doing a lot for your life to have it.
So two quick observations there. First of all, when I was a younger person, none of this would have been that important to me. But as I've grown older, I've realized that this notion of like what's going on with your mind, whether you can achieve silence, which would be a part of it, that's what life is. Like, that's everything. There's nothing to life beyond your conscious experience, at least in my opinion. Like, your experience of life is what the state of your mind is. And I think it's fairly well established at this point that the most pleasurable states of consciousness are these flow states where you're either not you're ruminating, is thinking about the past, and thinking about the future is what causes anxiety and things like that. In these flow states, you're not doing either. So what I find that I get in a flow state when I'm fly fishing in the mountains, or when I'm doing what I did at lunch today, which was train jujitsu with my friends. And when you're rolling with somebody, you don't have time to worry about what are we having for dinner tonight. Like, and you're in a state where you're having to kind of think about what you're doing somewhat. Like when you're fly fishing, you have to think about, okay, here's what the water looks like. Here's the bugs on the water. I'm going to use this fly to match up with the bug. So you do have to think a little bit, but once you're actively doing it, it's just, I mean, I think flow is the perfect word for it. It's hard to come up with a better word for it, but you're just kind of, you're like a river. You're just kind of flowing. And so the point number one is that this is, to me, like the most important endeavor any human can ever go on is examining your conscious states, which includes some of the silence that we've been talking about. But I tell you, I would be remiss. There's two more things, and Justin, I know you have to go here pretty quickly, but real quick before you guys have to go, there's two things I want to touch on that I think are super important. One of which is Leigh brought up the idea of psychedelics, and then the other one has to do. Both of you have mentioned this when you really get silence, like this what you see. Like, in other words, once all the chatter stopped, what actually is there? And so let's take the second question first. Like, when once you've gotten some silence, once all the distractions are gone and the noises in your head and the noises from outside and the images and all that stuff, once you kind of washed away that clutter, what's left?
You know, we look in the book, and we have a chapter in the book called Why Silence is Scary. And there was a study that was done recently at University of Virginia where a social psychologist put a bunch of undergrad students in a room by themselves with no phone, no distraction, nothing to do. And at the beginning of the study, everyone said that they would pay money rather than endure this painful electric shock to be possible.
I've heard
But
of this
after,
study. Yeah.
after about 15 minutes, 67% of the men and 25% of the women chose to shock themselves, a painful electric shock, rather than sit in the silence. So, like, to answer the question, what we often encounter, Brian, in the silence is dread, is not just boredom, but this restlessness. And we honor that. It's because there's a lot of work to do in the world. There's a lot of, like, it's FOMO writ large. People want to see what's going on in this world where we're wired to be gathering information and seeing what's happening on Twitter and seeing what's going on with our friends on the phone. But if we can tune in to this space of nothing happening, and if we can get comfortable with this space of nothing happening, then we find in our studies of this that it's possible to access a higher level of creativity and connect health. There's a study done at Duke Medical School that looked at the effect of different types of sounds on the brains of mammals. And it was silence, more than classical music, more than white noise, that stimulated the growth of neurons in the hippocampus, the part of the brain associated with memory. But it wasn't just the absence of noise. It was when the test subjects actually listened in conditions of deep silence that the most regeneration of neurons in the hippocampus happened.
Really?
So that's just one angle that we look at this from, the scientific angle, because we also look at what the mystic traditions of the world have said.
Yeah.
We look to Pythagoras, the ancient Greek philosopher 2,500 years ago, invented geometric theorems that are still used today, and systems for tuning instruments and meteorology that are still used today. And he required anyone who wanted to study in his inner circle to spend 5 years not talking.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing. That is so that is so cool. And I forget who said this quote, and I'm going to paraphrase it. I don't want to mess it up too bad, but essentially the quote goes something like this: most of the world's problems are caused by man's inability to sit in a room by himself for 5 minutes and do nothing. That's the paraphrase of the quote.
Blaise Pascal. Yeah.
Is that Pascal? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So in any event, what I've tried to do, and I actually, one of my mentors actually suggested this to me probably 5 or 6 years ago, but I'll tell you, this is going to sound utterly bizarre, but it works. So when I start work now, and this doesn't matter what your business is, your business involves any kind of thinking, you can try this. The way I start my work day now is I go up into my office with no phone, no computer, no nothing. And I sit in my chair for 15 minutes. I set a timer and I do nothing but think. I just let my mind go. And it is terribly difficult when you first start doing this, because you want to reach for your phone, you want to reach for a book, you want to reach for a cigar, you want to do something, like you want to distract yourself with something. But if you can kind of get through that, what I found is these ideas start bubbling up that if I didn't have this silent period, I would never hear. So in my day-to-day life, I might come up with a good idea, but it's almost like luck. Like, oh, I'll do this. That's a good idea. But it's just luck that I even paid attention to it. But when you sit down and carve out some space, 15, 20 minutes a day to literally do nothing, like literally do nothing, whatever it is, and we could have a whole nother hour-long podcast about how your brain works, but whatever it is that's causing these ideas to bubble up goes into overdrive. And like my best ideas, it's the same idea of like shower thoughts, like that's or driving thoughts when you don't have the radio on. It's the same idea. You're not distracted by other things, so your brain is actually able to generate ideas. Let's talk real quick, because I don't want to keep you, Justin, longer than I promised you. So real quick, let's talk about psychedelics and their relation to the mind and silence and things like that, because I know there's some discussion in the book. Leigh, you've got some experience studying like ritualized use of psychedelics and stuff. So tell us how these kinds of substances can pair with this idea of silence and things like that.
Yeah, well, so, as we mentioned in this book, we don't want to be prescriptive about like, this is the only way to find silence. And but this is my way, is what I came to understand as we were working on this, for that deeper type of silence. And why that is, I mean, my experience of that is that when there's all that preparation done, when we're coming together the way my teacher, Ralph Metzner, works, as we come into circle and there's a lot of thought and a lot of intention in a safe container, all those various stages to the ritual, that what happens for me internally is that I can discern the signal, what is true, what needs my attention, from the noise. That's why it's a deep, silent experience. It's a space where the signal becomes clear and apparent, maybe not right away, maybe not till 5 hours in. I just want to say that. And maybe not even every time, but
Right.
It's just the deepest practice for me to discern the signal from the noise. So that's why we felt it was important to speak to that, as well as the myriad other ways one can find that. Now, of course, there's tons of research going on as to why that is, looking at what's happening in the default mode network, that the me network, that is often kind of called the default mode network, is deregulated. And therefore that, like, all those stories of me is not happening perhaps.
Yeah.
And that there's the commonly felt experience of a flow-like state where there's a diminishment of the egoic self and an expansion of a self that's interconnected with other things, so it allows for me to kind of get connected to that which guides me, the signal. And for others we've spoken to, not psychedelics aside, when they're feeling that deep silence, they might be connecting to what's true in their heart, or where they can find compassion. So the sort of what guides you may differ, but the silence is really helping. That deep silence that I experience in those states, with all that practice around it, is that ability to discern the signal from the noise.
I've microdosed psilocybin, and it's been utterly remarkable, and it's hard to put into words really what it's like. It's almost ineffable in some ways. But one of the things that was very noteworthy to me was that on days that I microdosed, my meditations were so much deeper and so much more effortless. And so I could meditate for 30 minutes with no problem. And whereas before I tried that 30 minutes, I mean, there's times where that's difficult. Even if you're a long time meditator, 30 minutes, 45 minutes. There's days you just don't feel like doing it. I mean, today I meditated for 10 minutes and 9 minutes in, I was completely distracted. And I was like, okay, that's the day that I'm going to have today, but no big deal. We'll work on it tomorrow. But anyway, have you found that psychedelics enable people for whatever reason to get deeper into this brain state, this brain state of presence or silence or whatever we want to call it? Like I consider it a tool for, among other things, being able to go deeper into my own head.
Mhm. You know, it's a big difference sometimes with a microdosing experience and a big, like a heroic dose,
Yeah,
something,
sure,
or a big
sure. Yeah.
experience, because
Yeah.
there is a lot that can be said, in terms of neurochemistry, in terms of the physiology of a microdose experience, what's happening with the serotonin in the brain, and then also, use that word ineffable, just the ineffable opening. I think that's likely possible. And it's often in the big, talking about if it's a heroic dose of mushrooms, or an experience in a ritual or a ceremony, working with a sacrament. There can be an experience of a major amplification of everything that's already going on within a person.
Yeah.
And sometimes, we hear about the new science of psychedelics and these kinds of panaceas for being able to get over traumas and problems that people are facing. And I believe that that's very real. And we have to do the work. It's a
Yeah.
different mindset than like working with, SSRI kinds of antidepressive drugs, where it's just, okay, it's palliative, going to take the edge off or take away some of the pain that's happening. It's very much it's a situation where, in order to find this silence that we talk about in terms of pristine attention, we have to first encounter an amplified version of the noise. But that psychedelic experience can make it so clear that the noise is there, can show it to you in ways that it may sometimes be like will pop up in a 30-minute meditation. It may be that the noise is a little bit under the surface, that agitation, that anxiety, and in the expanded awareness in one of these settings, with one of these plant aids or psychedelics, or a sacred plant, all that becomes exposed, but we still have to do the work to clear ourselves.
Isn't that amazing? I find that a little paradoxical about psychedelics, that like, especially at higher doses, I mean, it is a nuclear explosion of experience. Like, I mean, it's basically like, okay, you want an experience? That's like the mushroom talking to you, or the ayahuasca or talking to you, or the ibogaine. You want an experience? I'm going to give you an experience like you've never had before. And it's this absolute freight train of stimulus that teaches you why all that stuff is not necessary. Like, it's this overwhelming stimuli experience that teaches you don't need all this stimulus. So I find that a little bit paradoxical. Justin, I know you got to go. I've kept you a little bit longer than I said I would. Leigh, we better let Justin go. I have a feeling he's got a commitment with his kids, because he's got young kids.
Yeah.
I have 3 kids too, so mine are teenagers now. But when they were your kids' age, Justin, I was the same way. I was basically, my wife told me where to go, and I just went wherever she told me to go when I told. But it's been great. Seriously, it's been really terrific. The book, again, everybody, Golden: The Power of Silence in a World of Noise, by Justin Zorn, Leigh Marz, and you can get that on Amazon and a bunch of other places. I get my books on Amazon. A fantastic book, does a really deep dive on a very important subject. We've really only scratched the surface of the book a little bit. I wish we had some more time, guys, to go into it. Maybe we can do this again, but it's been a real pleasure having you guys on the show. When I started this podcast in the middle of quarantine, everybody's fussing at each other online, and it felt like the world was collapsing. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to do a podcast with positive people and show that there's positive stuff going on in the world. You guys are absolutely the perfect guest for my show. You're doing great things. I love your book, and I love what you're both doing. And thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Oh, Brian, thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, grateful
Awesome.
for what you're doing too, sir. Thanks so much for having us. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys.